Link, that is a wonderful image of you. I'm so glad that that happened. Hi, if you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're old to the channel, what's up? Welcome back. My name's Dan, and I have been known to have a messy desk, but this week, like a couple weeks prior, we're kind of chilling away from those messy desks, because you know what? For the games I want to talk about today, you barely even need a table. These are two of my favorite GM-less role-playing games. Really, they tend more towards world-building games, but depending on your group, you can really go as deep as you want either way. Now, the neat thing about these games is that we actually have played both of them on our new podcast. That's right, the podcast really exists. It's real, and it's there, and there are episodes that you can go listen to right freaking now. The podcast is called We Like the Idea. It's on all the podcasting platforms that matter, I think, and hope. So go now and listen to those. Not now, but after this. Go after this. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about my two favorite GM-less games. So the first game I want to talk about is actually the game that got me into these kind of games, and it's called The Quiet Year. It's pretty popular as far as these games go, which is to say some of you might know what I'm talking about, but it is still criminally underrated as far as I'm concerned. The basic premise of The Quiet Year is that we are in a post-apocalyptic situation, though you don't necessarily have to play it that way, and we are in a settlement, and we kind of define some things about the settlement together, and then we draw a map, essentially, with some very basic terrain features. So maybe there's a waterfall a mile from here. Maybe there's a big mountain range. Maybe there's a giant statue of some great god that no longer exists, or whatever. Around the table, one by one, you add these elements, and then you start drawing cards from a 52-card deck. The cards are arranged by suit, and each suit represents a season. So you have 1 year, 4 seasons, to prepare for the Frost Shepherds, is what the book calls them. Really, it's just preparing for the end of the game, when this greater force comes and you are forced to reckon with whatever's going on. Now, every time you draw a card, there is a prompt attached to that, and I'll put some examples on screen as I talk, so you don't just have to look at me. And if you don't want to look at me especially, you can just look at a little Linky boy here. He's a good guy. Frank is out of frame, just staring at me, upset that I took his bone. Oh, here he comes to get it. Yeah. I'm talking about role-playing games. Would you like to comment? He refuses to comment at this time. We respect it. You have a choice between two prompts every time you draw a card, and you get to choose, which is great because not every prompt is what you want at that time. After you answer the prompt sufficiently, after you describe what it may be, for instance, one of them might be like, someone new arrives, who are they? Or someone leaves, who left? Who were they? Once you've spoken to the table and declared these things to be true, you then get to take an action. And those actions are broken up into a couple things. You can make a discovery, you can start a project, or you can hold a discussion. Each of these things have their own little rules that go with them. Making a discovery is literally just adding something to the map. You could be like, oh yeah, fucking Preston left, dude. Preston left. But he sent me a letter. I got a letter from him. And what he told me is that 3 miles north of here, there's another village, and they have like way fucking cooler toys. And what are we going to do about that as a settlement of 8-year-olds who want to have the coolest toys, right? We're going to have to go and kill them in ritual combat. You know, that kind of thing. Starting a project is exactly what it sounds like. You decide what kind of project you'd like your settlement to do, like building the laser guns to go kill the other 8-year-olds so we have the coolest toys. Maybe you don't have to kill them. Maybe you just hold them up. It's really your game to do what you will, but, you know, use your judgment. How long is that project going to take? Well, we are a bunch of 8-year-olds, so that project might take, a couple weeks, 6 even. Usually the game asks you to decide between 1 and 6 and just kind of roll with that. So let's say it would take 6 weeks. We put a 6-sided die down on the table, and each turn that passes, we step down that dice. When it resolves, you get to explain how it happened, how it went, and what the consequences of that are. After that, your turn is done, play passes to the next player, and they do that. the same thing. They draw a card from the deck, pick a prompt, start a project, hold a conversation, which I haven't explained yet, and I will now, I guess. Dogs are fighting over the bone now. Or make a discovery. Holding a discussion is maybe the least picked action, and I think it's because it asks you to go from a sort of top-down camera view to a very zoomed-in, intimate view, and it asks you to roleplay, and not everyone is as comfortable role-playing as they are world-building, which is completely fine. But it's a very, very useful action, and quite fun if you really lean into it enough. But yeah, past that is really the basis of the game, and you go through all of these seasons answering these prompts, building your world, generating a story of 1 year in this little settlement that can really be anything from a post-apocalyptic, post-nuclear setting to 8-year-olds trying to enact toy supremacy, man. I mean, it really runs the gamut, and you don't need to commit to the post-apocalyptic thing at all. My playgroup and I almost never have, for what it's worth. And we actually played that as in our second world building episode for the podcast. We played for 6 hours. It went a little long. The game does tend to run long. I typically recommend breaking it up into 2 play sessions. If you're anything like my friend group, do the first 2 seasons, take a break, then do the other 2. But if, you got a day to kill and you want to spend time telling a crazy story with your friends, I highly recommend it. Go check it out. I have a link in the description. This is not sponsored in any way, just a review. Avery Alder is a fantastic designer, and I cannot recommend checking out their work enough. So that's The Quiet Year. Draw a map, answer some prompts, tell a story. The world ends or something, right? The Frost Shepherds always come. If you draw 1 card from the Spade deck, I can never remember which. I think it's the King of Spades. That's when the game just ends, and you kind of discuss amongst yourselves how it ends. Some tips for playing the game, just real quick before I move on. There are turns in the game, right? You have a turn, then someone else does, but feel free to openly discuss things. You're not always going to have an idea for a prompt, but someone else might, and they should get to weigh in. Ultimately, the way that me and my friends play it is that, and I think the book suggests this as well, go ahead and get ideas from everybody, but ultimately you have the final say on what happens, right? It's your turn. You have the right to say, no, I think this happens instead. That's completely fine. So yeah, those are my suggestions if you're going to pick up The Quiet Year. Split the game into 2 sessions if you don't want it to run crazy long, or just don't linger on things for a long time like me and my friends do. I would say 6 hours is probably an abnormal runtime. It's probably closer to between 2 and 4 for most people. Be sure to let everyone weigh in, and ask for help if you don't have an idea for something. It is very common that someone will draw a card and be like, I don't know, anyone got anything? And then someone proposes something that sparks an idea. You get talking, and that's the whole point of the game, right? Is collective storytelling, collective world building. So that's The Quiet Year. One of my favorite games of all time. Will always recommend it. It's just very good, plain and simple. The second game I'd like to talk about, I actually own physically. I want to talk about The Ground Itself, which you almost certainly can't see in just my terrible lighting. But The Ground Itself is a game designed by Everest Pipkin that is functionally pretty similar to The Quiet Year in a lot of ways. It uses a 52-card deck. There are prompts that you're reading from. There are alternate actions you can do. This game very heavily draws inspiration from The Quiet Year, and I think Everest is pretty plain about that. But while they are quite similar, the role that they serve in terms of world building are really, really quite different. I would hesitate even to call The Quiet Year a world building game. It's really more of a storytelling game. I think you could make it a world building game if you explicitly want to set a campaign in that setting that you are, setting your small settlement in, but it's a little restricted for like a whole campaign that you want to build a whole world for, right? You want something a little more vast than just a small settlement of people. That's where The Ground Itself comes in. The Ground Itself is about telling the history of a place, and that place can really be as big or as small as you want. The book definitely mentions a lot of smaller areas like towns or a house or a church, but we, on our podcast, which you should check out below, used it to build an entire world. Some example questions. What was this place in the past? How long ago was that? What is this place called? Who named it and for what reason? What is valued in this place? What is it known to have in excess? What are the threats to this place? So on and so forth. You can spend as long or as little time as you want on that. The book suggests you take about 20 minutes to do it. My friend group and I, on average, spend an hour or two because we are who we are and we can't help ourselves. But after you do that, you roll 2d6, 2 6-sided dice. And what that does is establish something really important, and it's what makes this game so freaking cool. The first dice you roll establishes a span of time. So 1 would be days, 2 is weeks, 3 is years, 4 is decades, 5 is centuries, and 6 is millennia. And the second dice determines how many of those spans of time. So let's say I roll a 6 and a 2. That's 2,000 years. Let's say I roll a 4 and a 3. That's, my memory's already failing me, that's 3 decades. What the book does is it has you draw cards randomly from the deck. It has you sort them into a certain order, which I won't bother explaining because it's not really that important. When you draw the number 10, suits don't matter, but when you draw the number 10, time jumps. We move in history. And we move in history that amount that we just rolled. For the first, they're called cycles, for the first cycle. So let's say I rolled a 6 and a 2. I'm moving forward or backwards 2,000 years in my world's history. And that's pretty crazy, right? You establish your place, you answer some prompts about it, and then the game kind of grabs you by the ear and tugs you. Now, granted, it's not as difficult if you're just moving weeks or years, but my group has rolled high every time. We have moved centuries and we have moved millennia, and that happens in our game. We move 4,000 years into the future. The questions that it makes you ask yourself are really wild. You're forced to kind of consider just how long that time is. Like something to consider is like cars are barely 100 years old. And look at how far they've come. Like 4,000 years is a crazy amount of time, right? Like what goes on, what changes in that span of time is can be a functionally different world. And this is where some people have an issue with the game, which is that it almost feels like you're creating multiple settings rather than one. But the really neat thing is that there are prompts that will call back to things you've already decided because you draw the same numbers multiple times. Remember, there's numbers in different suits, so you're going to draw the same numbers. The book has iterative prompts. So the first 2 you draw will have John's here and he's hungry. And then the second 2 you draw will be like, John brought his whole family, now they're hungry, right? And so the game is always making you look back on choices you've made, consider that past history, and really kind of go from there, really build atop that. We, in our game of The Ground itself, jumped 4,000 years, then 500 years, then a couple hundred more, I think. It was really beautiful the way something from 4,700 years ago could come up, especially in our game of The Quiet Year, which is set, again, 4,700 years from where we start. We're calling back to these things, right? There really does feel like a tangible, real history built into this world that you can pull from. And like, man, I can't recommend enough if you're a GM playing this game with your players before you play a campaign, because your player's investment in the setting is going to skyrocket when they have had a hand in building it from the ground up. The ground itself up, maybe. Yeah, I really can't recommend The Ground itself enough. It might be my favorite world building tool currently. It has never let me down, and it is just a joy to play. And really accessible. I mean, you hand it to anybody and, they might be a little hesitant at first, but you start throwing ideas at them, bouncing ideas back and forth. And man, it's really cool when you see someone's eyes light up and they get it. Yeah, just really awesome stuff. I will put Everest's itch page down there. They have a lot of really great games, as does Avery Alder. Some quick cons for both games. The Quiet Year tends to lend itself to darker places than sometimes you want to go. At least that's been my experience. Things almost always take a very sinister turn, which is great, but not always what you want. You hear in our game of The Quiet Year, if you end up listening to it, and if you do, God bless you, things get super dark, and then we're able to kind of pull it back consciously to a place that was a little more measured. So that's something that's a little rough. The end of the game is always a little disappointing, because you just feel like, and then it's just over, right? There's nothing to really be done about that. But, that's the game. So that's the game. It has to end sometime. I always like to have kind of a wrap up and talk about, maybe what happens in the coming days, weeks, whatever. For the ground itself, similar to the Quiet Year, it runs quite long. I have yet to play a complete game. We have willingly stopped because we've been happy with the amount of material that we've acquired. Granted, we really harp on stuff. We really build and build and build. Your play group might move a little more swiftly. Maybe you play the whole game and that kind of generates you what you need. Other than that, though, I really don't have many criticisms. Some of the prompts in the ground itself aren't fantastic, or at least aren't super inspiring to the way that I like to build worlds. They're sort of hyper-specific and I guess maybe geared more towards smaller settings, smaller settlements. But the nice thing is, a mechanic I totally blanked on mentioning, is that if you don't like a prompt, you can discard your card and do some other things. You can tell a story, throw a party, discover something, see an omen, leave the frame, or move on. Moving on is just skipping your turn. I don't really know that anyone's ever going to do that. But for us, leaving the frame has been our favorite because it lets you step out of your place and look beyond that horizon a little bit, glimpse beyond the veil. And that's super dope. So, the game has a built-in thing if you don't like the prompts. Quiet Year does not. My rule with the Quiet Year is if you don't like the prompt, just discard it and move on. If someone else has an idea, let's talk about it and we can just run with it, but let's keep the game moving because, ultimately, the game's long already. Let's not dwell on prompts we don't feel good about. And that's it, really. Like I said earlier, the games are quite similar in their form, but quite different in their function. I would use the Quiet Year to tell a very focused, kind of self-contained story. I wouldn't necessarily tend towards it anymore for direct world building, which isn't to say it can't be done, but just not my favorite anymore. Whereas the ground itself has been fantastic for building entire settings, for building whole worlds. I really prefer that. You won't be able to tell a focused story because you're going to be leaping all over the place. So it really just depends on your preference, what you feel like doing, and what your goals are. For us, it was to create a campaign setting for our podcast, which you can go check out now. It's called We Like the Idea. It's on all podcast platforms, yada, yada. Other than that, I'm just going to go now. I've talked about the games, and now the video's over. So thanks for hanging out. Could have spent the time with anybody, but you spent it with me. And I think that's crazy and awesome and still sort of surreal. Thanks for everyone for hanging out. And if you're new to the channel, thanks for sticking around and watching. Like I said, Patreon link down below. If you want to support the stuff I make, please go listen to the podcast. I know I'm saying it a lot, but I really have failed to plug this at all. So please go check out the podcast if you're into this sort of thing. I really think we have something special on our hands, and I'm eager to share it with you. And past that, there's nothing else to say except I'm Daniel. This is my messy house, and I love you more than I love building worlds, but only barely. I'll see you when I see you.